Ну что, друзья, будем, наверное, начинать потихоньку. Меня зовут Евгений Прейгерман, я директор по исследованию общественного объединения «Либеральный клуб». И сегодня имею честь модерировать эту лекцию. Прежде чем мы перейдем на английский язык, потому что лекция на английском языке, пару совсем организационных объявлений. Те из вас, кто с английским на «вы» пока еще, вот там вот есть дополнительные наушники, и там все будут вам переводить. У нас есть замечательный переводчик, который спрятался вот там вот в кабинке, так что не стесняйтесь, берите, пожалуйста. Вопросы впоследствии тоже можно задавать на любом языке, выбирая из трех: русский, белорусский, английский. И, наверное, все. Постепенно народ еще будет подходить, поэтому мы переходим на английский язык. So, welcome once again. Welcome, Richard, to Minsk once again as well. Thanks for coming. I'm privileged to be moderating this lecture, which is titled Towards a More Geopolitical Eastern Partnership. But I think we're going to cover quite a lot of issues which in this or that way have to do with Eastern Europe and European Union's policy here in the area. And the initial question that we wanted to discuss here was whether there are going to be any fundamental changes in Europe and in the EU's policy towards our region after the Ukraine crisis, which is most probably going to bring some serious novelties to the international order in Europe. But we'll start with a 30-minute lecture by Richard, where he's going to focus mostly on the issue of a more geopolitical Eastern partnership. He also asked me to remind you that Richard is an expert on EU's foreign policy, but not probably that much on Belarus-EU relations. So we, of course, might tackle that, but don't make a big focus on that. So let's go beyond the usual topics. Okay, and now a couple of words about Richard. I'm sure most of you know him by his publications, first of all, which are of usually of great interest to all of us here in the region. But Richard holds an undergraduate degree from Cambridge University, an MA and PhD degrees from Warwick University in the UK. He is a senior associate in the Democracy and Rule of Law program based at Carnegie Europe. He is an expert on the foreign policy of the EU. Richard is also a professor of international relations at Warwick University. And prior to joining Carnegie in 2013, he was director of the Madrid and Brussels-based famous think tank FRIDE. He also held positions in the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He was senior fellow at the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, D.C. from 2012 to 2013. And Richard's interests focus on the development of EU foreign policy, European responses to the Arab Spring, trends in international democracy, and current debates over democracy promotion strategies. Last but of course not least, he is an author of 7 books already, and I know the 8th is in progress, right? The latest one is called The Uncertain Legacy of Crisis, European Foreign Policy Faces the Future, and it was published in January this year, and I think it's a very good introduction to what we are going to talk about today. So, Richard, please, the floor is yours. And afterwards, I'll come back with some questions, and then we'll open it up for all of you to ask questions. Okay, welcome, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Evgeny. Thank you to the Liberal Club and to the Office for Democratic Belarus for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back in Minsk. And thank you to everyone for turning out. I realise it's a uniquely challenging venue to find, so it shows real commitment for everyone to have made it here. I've set some very tricky questions to try and answer, but what is clearly a very worrying moment for European security. I was asked to consider the question of how far what is happening in the region is seen as a fundamental threat to the European order by European governments, how serious the European governments perceive the danger to be in what has been happening in Ukraine and across the region in the last 8 or 9 months, And what are European governments trying to do in terms of their response to the crisis? And in particular, to address the very important question of how effective the European Union can be in trying to reduce the effects of the crisis, and whether the crisis is driving the European Union towards a different type of foreign policy in the countries that embrace its Eastern partners. And for that reason, we titled the presentation, the debate we will have here tonight, on the question of whether the EU's Eastern Partnership is becoming more geopolitical. My headline answer to this question is yes. The EU is seeking a much more geopolitical presence in the countries of the Eastern Partnership, but we don't quite agree on what geopolitics actually means. And this really is the subject of debate at the moment between European governments. If we take some steps back and establish what the basic context is, I think we all know the basic situation that pertain in the run-up to the crisis that we're witnessing at the moment. The Eastern Partnership, since its creation in 2009, has been very, very low profile. It has not really systematically addressed the issue of geopolitical challenges in the region. It was never supposed to be explicitly about geopolitics. It was more a reflection of European soft power, supposedly about the EU encouraging very modest forms of cooperation, of the EU supporting its, exporting its own rules and standards to the region. It was formulated in 2009 in the wake of the incursion into Georgia, so it did have some degree of political dimension to its creation, but the way it was set up, the way European governments defined the Eastern Partnership, almost seemed to reject the notion of traditional geopolitics. European governments always insisted that the Eastern Partnership was not about the EU directly competing with other large powers for primacy, for influence in the East, that it was a way of encouraging positive sum cooperation, of helping countries like Belarus, like Ukraine, that the 6 countries that are incorporated into the Eastern Partnership, helping them develop, but also helping them develop better relations not only with the European Union, but also with Russia. That was the philosophy. That was the hopeful philosophy upon which the Eastern Partnership was based. Clearly, that philosophy at the moment looks comprehensively to have failed. And it is this which is now engendering a set of very difficult debates amongst European governments. The basic question which I was asked to address today, there is no consensus on this basic question of how serious the threat is today to the European order. If you talk to some European governments, their perception, their feeling, their fear is that what we are seeing with Ukraine and Russia's actions in Ukraine is not only a very serious situation for Ukraine, but represents a more systemic threat. A more systemic threat. It represents a danger to the kind of fundamental norms upon which the whole European system of security and economic cooperation has been based over recent decades. Others say this is an exaggeration. This is an exaggeration. The situation is extremely serious. It's extremely serious above all for Ukrainians, but we should not necessarily conclude yet that it represents the death of the whole way in which the order, the European security and economic order is based. And we should not overreact, which in a way that actually reinforces the danger, the precariousness of the European order. So, at the heart of this problem, I think we still have a fundamental and a philosophical difference between European governments over just how serious a threat we are facing, and therefore what are the most effective ways of dealing with this new situation, and the ways in which the EU should respond to the crisis in a way that is of most benefit to Eastern Partnership countries. So this is the crucial question at stake here. To what extent is the EU moving to change the way it interacts with Eastern Partnership countries? In a qualitative way, is the EU beginning to change the nature of its foreign policy towards Eastern Partnership countries? The answer is, to some extent, yes. All the rhetoric amongst European governments now agrees with the fact that the EU needs to be more geopolitical. That for a long time the EU was almost in denial about the fact that there are intensely geopolitical issues at stake, and some of the traditional forms of European soft power are clearly not adequate as a response. But having said that, how exactly the EU defines geopolitics, what kind of geopolitical responses are more effective, is an issue upon which there are still wide differences between European governments, and on which opinions change week to week as the nature of the crisis in Ukraine is clearly evolving and in an extremely fluid situation. What does this mean? What does this mean for the ways in which, the precise ways in which the EU seeks to support Eastern Partnership countries, including Belarus, and what does it mean for the EU's relations with Russia? Is it the case that the EU is beginning to move from a situation where it was committed to positive cooperation with Russia, trying to help Russia develop, trying to make Russia stronger, more economically prosperous, to a situation where the EU is much more concerned with containing Russia in a less positive fashion? Again, there is no definitive answer to these questions at the moment, but what I will give you is a flavour of some of the debates going on within the European Union. There is a feeling within the EU that certainly in the United States there is a lot of debate about us having to move back towards a kind of Cold War logic of containment vis-à-vis Russia and vis-à-vis the eastern neighbourhood. The EU does not quite share this kind of conclusion to be drawn from the crisis, and the debate is a more subtle one. It's a more nuanced one within the European Union. How can the EU show itself capable of exerting greater pressure, being much more effective in meeting the aspirations of citizens across Eastern Partnership countries, but at the same time leaving the door open to some degree of constructive engagement with Russia? Of course, the possibilities of that engagement with Russia are not entirely in the hands of the European Union. I think most governments feel slightly defensive, precisely because in large measure it will be up to Russia how that relationship with European powers develops over the future. And the kind of structuring question or debate to all of this is whether Russian actions today in Ukraine finally push European governments to cooperate, to unite on foreign policy in a way that they have not done previously. Will Russia, in a sense, act finally as a catalyst for a more united European approach to the Eastern Partnership that so far has failed to emerge? So to try and answer those questions, to give you a flavour of how the EU is debating those questions, I want to touch on four basic questions, four basic elements of current European debates. How far is the EU increasing its commitment to the Eastern Partnership? How does the EU define geopolitics and the need to defend basic international order in the European space? How is the EU changing the terms of its engagement with Eastern partners? And fourth, how are the internal dynamics to the EU's foreign policy being influenced by the crisis? How does the basic way in which the EU formulates its foreign policy, who are the key actors, the key powers in EU foreign policy, again changing because of the nature of this crisis? So, issue number one. It is clear that after the crisis started at the beginning of this year, the EU moved to intensify its commitment to the Eastern Partnership. The summit in Vilnius in November last year was a shock. It was a shock for European governments to see how little the EU achieved at the summit, not just because of the situation in Ukraine, but because of the pushback it received in a sense from most of the Eastern Partnership countries. So this rethinking on the part of European governments actually started slightly before what we saw in Crimea and what we are currently seeing in eastern Ukraine. There was a realization that the EU needs to move up several gears in the intensity of its commitment to the Eastern Partnership. Since then, we've seen several new policy documents issued on the part of the European Union, which are promising many improvements in the Eastern Partnership. The EU now agrees we need to invest more money, more generous incentives for Eastern partners. We need to be more closely addressing the needs and the interests of Eastern partners. The EU needs to do a better job at basically explaining what the European Union is, what the EU offers, what its policies are really about. There's a recognition that still the degree of understanding of what the EU is basically about is far too limited. There is a realization that the EU needs to make better what it calls differentiation, more of a difference. It needs to understand better the differences between Belarus and Ukraine, between Moldova and Georgia or Azerbaijan. It needs to tailor its approaches much more specifically to individual countries. It needs to make its offers far more generous. The EU is now talking about the possibility in the long term of having a common economic area to cover all the 6 countries potentially of the Eastern Partnership. It needs to be far more flexible in implementing its free trade areas, its association agreements, and also needs to focus more on what it calls the multilateral track, trying to make sure that the EU is contributing in a positive way to regional cooperation between different Eastern partners. So the EU now, at least in theory, seems to acknowledge that it needs to be offering a lot more to Eastern partners. One of the results of the crisis is that national governments, member state governments, are now a lot more engaged in the Eastern Partnership. Before the crisis started, the policy was a relatively low-profile, almost technical policy run by the EU institutions, but many European governments at the national level were engaged to a very limited degree. This is not so much the case now. The crisis has had an effect of increasing the engagement of key European governments, Germany, France, the UK, amongst others, who had not been that engaged before last year. So in that sense, it's become more political. And you can see this more political tone to the policy in all the documents that the EU has released in the last 8 or 9 months. The EU is talking about redefining its European neighbourhood policy and talking about explicitly adding security issues to the neighbourhood policy. Again, before the crisis started, there was virtually no mention of security within the neighbourhood policy. It simply wasn't seen as being about fundamental security issues. Again, the crisis has had the effect of changing that basic perception, and the focus on security is now much higher up the list of European priorities. The crisis has had the effect of accelerating, of pushing forward, of speeding up many of the offers that the EU had made to Eastern partners. As I'm sure you all know, the signing of 3 association agreements with Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia was accelerated and was finalized at the end of June this year. This was a timetable that originally the EU was saying was impossible to meet. I think because of the gravity of the situation, the EU did manage to speed up and meet one of the complaints that had traditionally been coming from Eastern partners, which was that the EU may have promised lots of benefits, but has always been very, very slow in actually delivering and implementing those promises on the ground. So the EU in some ways does seem to have sped up, and the EU is talking about the need to be a lot more flexible, and particularly offering different kinds of benefits to the countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan and Belarus, the 3 countries that have not signed association agreements, who, as you all know, do seem to be indicating that they do want some degree of cooperation with the EU, but perhaps of a more flexible nature. So, increased commitment, more flexibility, more speed, a faster reaction, all these elements to European policy are beginning to be developed. The EU needs to do a lot more, but the crisis has had the impact of at least getting the EU thinking about improving these dimensions of its policy. However, there is still, to my mind, a fundamental difference in the way that the EU understands geopolitics compared to the way Russia understands geopolitics in this region. A fundamental difference or asymmetry in just how important the crisis is judged to be. It's been routinely pointed out, by many people, that what has happened in Ukraine for Russia is seen as an existential matter. It's seen as a matter that is of vital importance to Russia's identity, its future projection of power, even the survival of its current regime. For the European Union, this is different. For the European Union, this is different. What is happening is seen as a serious challenge for European security, but it is not, in my judgment, yet seen as an existential threat. It is still seen almost as an issue of second-order importance. This means that in practice, despite all the European rhetoric about the crisis representing a menace, a risk to the whole European order, in practice, the way that the European Union is responding so far, doesn't suggest that European governments really see that the threat is one to the whole European order. This is not the first time this has happened. There is a pattern to European policy here. After the attacks of 9/11, when the Arab Spring started, the European Union's rhetoric was that everything had changed. the whole of European foreign policy had to change, that this was now a fundamentally different world in which we were living. In practice, there was more continuity than change to these areas of EU policy. And I can see the same pattern now repeating itself in the East. Very famously, after the Crimean annexation, the President of the European Council suggested or made the quote that now everything was different. Everything was different. However, again, in practice, there is at least as much continuity in European policy as there is change. European governments still see other issues as more important than what is happening in Ukraine. Notwithstanding the rhetoric in terms of kind of fundamental threats, they would see what's happening in the Middle East with the Islamic State, China's rising power, the transatlantic free trade talks as issues that are more important in terms of international order. So when we come back to this question that we were set to discuss today, the crisis is clearly one that is extremely serious from Europe's point of view, but in terms of the factors that are likely to condition the future of international order, I'm not sure the crisis we see with Russia and Ukraine at the moment really is seen as the most important issue by most European governments. This means the EU is not set to become a major provider of security to Eastern Partnership countries. This has been debated many times within the European Union, but in terms of the desire of some EAP states to see some degree of greater protection provided by the European Union against other powers, the EU is still falling short in terms of meeting these basic aspirations. You will all know that the focus was very much on Ukraine at last week's NATO summit, but it was very conspicuous that European governments, or nearly all European governments, are not offering concrete military assistance to the Ukraine government. The Ukraine government has asked for this, and the majority of European governments have argued that this would not be helpful. It would actually further inflame the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And this is one of the major sources of tension at the moment with the Ukrainian government. So, and vitally important, if anything has changed that is of really dramatic significance over the last 9 months, it has been the fact that it's the United States that seems to have come back into the Eastern European region, where it had almost absented itself in the 3 or 4 years prior to the crisis. And many European governments would argue that the real geopolitical priority has to be to try to re-engage with the United States in the region, rather than the EU per se providing the really preeminent leadership. So it's this effort to rebuild kind of transatlantic cooperation within the region, rather than the Eastern Partnership per se, that is the focus of a lot of European governments' geopolitical efforts. So, again, we see a lot of assertive language coming from NATO at the moment, and you will have all seen this in the context of the summit last week. But it's important to make the following point about NATO. That NATO's concern, in a way, is very defensive. It's not about cooperating with Eastern Partnership countries. It's not about the agenda of transforming the Eastern Partnership states. It's about the basic defense of European territory, of European Union territory. It's about Article 5. It's about European governments suddenly feeling a lot more defensive and nervous. worried that actually NATO territory, European Union territory, may in the future be under threat. Many people would say this is a completely exaggerated prospect, but it is one now that's being seriously debated. And so the very fact that it's NATO that has become so concerned with the way that the crisis has evolved, in a way reflects that the EU is feeling, what European governments are feeling, much more defensive, much more nervous about their security, and in a way it's a retrenchment of the original objectives of the Eastern Partnership. It's a sign that the aims of the Eastern Partnership, in a way, are becoming more modest. The EU is, to some degree, more concerned with the defence of its own borders than it is with fundamentally transforming or cooperating the partners in Eastern Europe. So, that's the first question of how far the EU's commitment is really intensifying as a result of the crisis. Second issue that's changed is that the EU is beginning to change the terms of engagement, its terms of engagement within the partners in the EAP space. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that there is a debate over how far the EU should still prioritise issues like human rights, like democracy, as a priority within its policies. There are many governments who would now argue that the EU should be a lot more flexible in the way that it engages with governments, including with Belarus, with the 6 governments, and a fear that in the past the EU may have been rather overly heavy, overly strict in some of the conditionality it has applied to Eastern Partnership countries, and as a result of that may have lost influence and lost support amongst many people in Eastern Partnership countries. However, there is a balance going on here within European debates. There is a feeling that the EU needs to be more practical and more flexible, but at the same time a feeling that if the EU has any comparative advantage over Russia in the region, it is precisely because it stands for a different type of political model. And that if it is to hold any kind of appeal to citizens across Eastern Partnership countries, it is precisely because it keeps at least some degree of focus on underlying issues of economic and political reform. And if the EU is to have any kind of influence on these issues, it needs to significantly increase the incentives it offers to governments, to civil society partners, and to be more flexible in the way that it delivers those benefits. And that it needs to broaden out. It needs to broaden out the range of its partnerships across the region. So I'm sure as people here know better than I do, many people judge the EU to be committed only to engaging with pro-Europeans across the region, rather than with the full range of partners in all these countries. And I think belatedly, European governments are beginning to realise that this is the kind of area where the EU does need to change. So that's the second question. Third issue, the balance between what we might call inclusion and exclusion within European thinking on geopolitics, the way that the European order works. The European philosophy has always been based on the assumption that power is about inclusion. The best way to wield power is to offer inclusion. And the line that has been often stated since the crisis started is that the best prospect that the EU has of exerting influence is not getting into any kind of direct confrontation with Russia, but in offering better and more positive support to making sure that Eastern Partnership countries are more resilient, are more successful, are better governed. And the way to do this, crucially, is to make sure that they are more deeply, more systematically integrated into what we might call the European space. So that's a lot of the thinking, that explains a lot of the thinking behind the way that the EU understands geopolitics. However, it is not an approach that in practice is being followed through as fully as it could be. And in particular, what has not happened as a result of the crisis is for the EU to start offering membership perspectives to Eastern Partnership countries. And this is a source of great disappointment to countries like Georgia, like Ukraine, like Moldova. Their argument, whether rightly or wrongly, their argument is that the best thing the EU can do to offer support is to offer the possibility of full membership into the European Union, which may only take place in 20 years, but at least the possibility, the promise of that membership could have a fundamental difference on the way that these societies act and the way that they are able to resist pressure from other kinds of power. To my mind, it's significant that, again, despite governments talking about this being a really serious epoch-changing crisis, in practice there is no new debate in the EU about enlargement, about the EU expanding to include Eastern Partnership countries. So, again, the rhetoric is of a fundamentally serious threat to European order, but in practice, European governments still feel that domestically, they are in such a serious situation because of the economic crisis, because of rising Euroscepticism, that the possibility of further expanding the European Union to include Eastern Partnership countries is simply not on the agenda. And there is a big tension between the EU's internal priorities and what it perceives to be its external strategic imperatives. So that's the issue. In a sense, this leaves the countries of the Eastern Partnership as a kind of middle land and a kind of middle territory between the EU and Russia, rather than the EU offering them full incorporation into the EU sphere of influence. That hasn't fundamentally changed since the crisis started. That's the issue of inclusion. The question of exclusion is obviously one that relates to Russia. As you all know, the EU was very reluctant to implement really serious sanctions against Russia. Most European governments still argue in terms of positive engagement with Russia because of what happened with the shooting down of the Malaysian aircraft. European governments almost felt obliged to implement for the first time serious, meaningful sanctions against Russia. But although the sanctions now are meaningful, they will have an impact on Russia, they will have a serious impact on the European economy as well. Still, the preference of most European governments is not fully to isolate Russia. There is still the argument made on the part of most European governments that there needs to be some continued engagement with Russia, and in a way that the crisis makes kind of mediated diplomacy between European governments and Russia more necessary rather than less necessary. Again, I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong, whether this is the right judgment or the wrong judgment, but despite all the debates about sanctions, there is still a feeling, particularly from the German and French governments, that the most constructive way forward is to engage in kind of high diplomacy mediation with the regime in Moscow. Time will tell whether this judgment proves to be correct. Fourth and final aspect of the way that the crisis has changed European foreign policy is what it does to the EU's internal dynamics. What do I mean by this? I mean that the institutional pattern of the way that the EU makes decisions is beginning to change. Member states, and certain member states, are assuming a much higher priority role in European decisions compared to the traditional EU institutions. In a way, policy towards Eastern Europe is becoming slightly less Europeanized and more a question of a select number of European governments taking the lead role. Some people would argue this is a good thing, that it's only these really committed big European governments that have the power, that have the strength to take the strategic elements of the crisis fully into account. This is particularly the case with Poland. Poland has been the most active and committed state in trying to increase the level of commitment of the EU since the crisis started. But perhaps most significantly, this is the key foreign policy test for Germany. I think everyone here will realize that the lead player, it's Germany that's really emerging as the lead player in this crisis. And to some extent, Germany has responded very well. Almost for the first time, it's shown a willingness to take the lead in European foreign policy, to lead efforts at diplomacy, to become much more systematically engaged in a way that it has not done in relation to other crises around the world. So in some senses, this reflects the fact that Germany is finally stepping up to provide a lead role in European foreign policy. And a lot of this has to do with what's happening inside the European Union. I mean, you will all know, because of the European crisis, the economic crisis, German power, German influence is much more obvious and much more dominant today than it was before the crisis. Again, however, despite a German willingness to take the lead role, I think it's still an open question of whether Germany is willing to follow through completely and really show that it's got the commitment and it's willing to put the resources behind its diplomacy in a way that could really make a significant difference to the way that the crisis evolves. So there is new German ambition there, but also a feeling on the part of several other European governments that Germany sometimes is pursuing a line, particularly on Russia, with which other European governments don't fully agree and don't fully go in line with formal overall European Union objectives. So a key test for Germany, for Poland, and a key test of whether overall European policy can involve the big committed European governments, but at the same time the EU institutions, the External Action Service, the European Commission, and others that speak more for a common European commitment to the Eastern Partnership. So, they are my four questions, I think for me, the four ways, the four crucial dimensions in which the crisis is having an impact on foreign policy. As I said, my basic conclusion, my one-line conclusion, would be that the crisis is forcing the EU to think more geostrategically, to become a little bit more harder-edged in the way that it tries to use its power in Eastern Europe, but still it understands the crisis, the geopolitical dimensions of the crisis, in quite a distinctive way. it still does not approach geopolitics in the same way as other big powers, and the importance it gives to these geopolitical dimensions still is not as great as those other powers are investing their efforts in the region. The big question to my mind is how effective can this EU policy really be? The EU is trying to improve and showing some commitment to improving its policy in Eastern Europe without going to the extreme of developing a really kind of realpolitik, hard, power-dominated approach to the region, without trying to avoid getting drawn into any kind of overt confrontation with Russia. Can this be effective? My answer would be that so far it's clearly more effective in some Eastern states than it is in others. And I think there will be this big difference between the different Eastern European states. And at the moment we have the clear distinction between the three countries, Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, that have signed association agreements and with whom the crisis seems to have actually increased their desire to have more cooperation with the European Union rather than decreased it. A difference between those three countries and the three Eastern Partnership countries that are still lagging behind and for whom the strategic challenge is one that is much more complicated and one that is much more about balancing European and Russian influences. And I think for those countries, the EU still hasn't found a particularly effective means of influence and is still not really having any greater influence than it was before the crisis. The balance, to my mind, is the following. The balance that will determine how effective the European Union can be. On the one hand, the EU needs to be more pragmatic. The way that the kind of challenge that Russia is posing for the European Union requires the EU to be more pragmatic, more geopolitical, more responsive to what is a really serious strategic threat. But at the same time, the EU needs to retain a focus on what makes it different. Its focus on underlying reform, on long-term reform potentials, on trying to mediate differences between different factions to the tensions we see across the Eastern European area. And for me, that is the challenge that basically defines the answer to the question that we were set. How can the EU defend the threat that is being posed to European order? Can it retain the elements that has made it distinctive as an international actor, but update those aspects of its external policies in recognition of the fact that the threat that the EU is facing today is fundamentally different compared to what it seemed to be facing 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give some applause. Let me jump in with a couple of questions before we open it up for all of you. And let me begin with some fresh news. Just a couple of hours ago, the new European Commission was unveiled. And we already knew a couple of persons who were there. Apart from the president of the Commission, we knew who the new High Representative would become. But now we've discovered that there was an interesting new post, which was previously called, correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner for Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy, and which is now called, in a more interesting fashion, Commissioner for Neighborhood Policy and Enlargement Negotiations. So this appointment, plus we have the Polish guy, the still acting Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, being appointed as the President of the European Council. So, Richard, how would you read all these appointments against the debates that you've basically shed light on during your time.
So over the last 6 months, Brussels has been dominated by these debates over who would take which posts, exactly how these different posts would be defined. Often to people outside Brussels, this is almost incomprehensible, these internal debates. Which member state would be given which post? These debates have gone on for a long, long time. I'm not sure they're the most important factor. I think it is clear that the fact that now the President of the European Council is a high-level Polish politician will give an extra dynamism to policy in the East. I think it is certain that, particularly on Ukraine, he will have a significant degree of interest, and I think raise the political level of debate within the European Union. It may be that the new High Representative, is in effect the EU's foreign minister. It may be that she focuses rather more on the Middle East and on other kinds of challenges. And I think because for one very important reason, and that is, in a way, the crisis in the East is of such gravity now that many people would agree that the person who will hold real power over this is Angela Merkel rather than particular commissioners. And in a way that reflects precisely what I've been saying, that before the crisis started, Eastern Partnership policy was almost left to one or two really committed European commissioners. And they were very interested in trade issues, in certain technical issues, but I think now we're talking about the need for a much more political kind of engagement. And I think it's perhaps the combination of the German leadership, the French leadership, and the new leadership of the European Council that will be key in determining the way that European policy develops.
I would also like to go back to your probably major argument about the EU becoming more geostrategic. But you still say that this is not exactly the definition of being geostrategic that the rest of the big powers in the world would have, right? But then, if we were straight with this, does the EU have any geostrategic or strategic thinking if it's still different from the rest of the world? If the neighborhood, which is to the east of the EU, is per se, as you said, not as important to the EU as it is for the Americans, then again, what kind of power? Is it just incapable of being geostrategic? Okay, let's go directly to that. Is it incapable? If it is incapable because it is exclusively a liberal IR power, or is it incapable just because we haven't overcome the historic period where it becomes capable?
So this is a really good question, and probably the core question at the moment for the European Union. Many people, many analysts, many think tank people, if they were sitting here, would answer this question completely negatively. They would argue that the EU is completely incapable of thinking geostrategically, certainly of acting geostrategically. I think the answer is a little bit more balanced, is a little bit more nuanced. Perhaps a year or 2 years ago, this was the case. I think the EU has begun to change now. It has begun to think a little bit more geostrategically. I think the crisis in Ukraine is one element amongst several that has pushed it in that direction. I don't think it's the only factor. I don't think this is just about Russia. I think it's a series of factors that has begun to convince European governments and also all the EU, the common EU institutions in Brussels, that the EU does need to be a bit more political, a bit more targeted in the way that it uses its influence. Unfortunately, this has come about a little bit late. The EU really needed to have arrived at this conclusion 5 or 6 years ago. I'm sure, as you all realise, because of the economic crisis, European power today is much weaker than it was in 2007, 2008. The EU is simply not capable of dictating outcomes to anyone. Even if it was before the crisis, it certainly isn't today. And therefore it needs to think more creatively about the way it uses the influence that it does possess. And I think it's a key test for the European Union. I would not say that the EU is incapable of thinking geostrategically. It's aware that the nature of the whole world order is changing, and that the EU perhaps needs to be a little bit idealistic in a traditional liberal sense, but that if we go too far in the opposite direction, actually what appeal, what comparative advantage does the European Union offer? The EU will not be capable of exerting the kind of power that Russia exerts better than Russia exerts that kind of power. We will never be better in exerting the kind of power that China exerts better than China exerts it. So it's a challenge of trying to retain some degree of the kind of liberal approach to international security challenges, but realizing we're doing that within a very different context. Many European governments are quite downbeat. They're quite pessimistic at the moment. There is a perception that in Ukraine the EU is losing. Again, I'm not saying it's right to pose this in terms of a question of who's winning and who's losing, but the general feeling is that the EU is on the back foot, that we've constantly been running to keep up with Russia on this issue, and that we haven't found a good way of responding to the challenges. The kind of optimistic interpretation given by European governments is that we still have the good long-term vision. We still have the vision that is really capable of influencing states and societies in the long term. We have the vision that is capable of producing kind of sustainable security, sustainable reform. The trouble is getting from the short term to the long term. And if in the short term the EU is not capable of, for example, making sure that Ukraine still exists as a single state in the long term, then the more positive dimensions of the EU vision begin to look a little bit irrelevant.
Well, the last one for me, a bit different. We already know the EU is not going to large, right? Even if we read this new post in the European Commission, but even without that. But then, is there a prospect for de-enlargement? I mean, your country, the UK. Does the crisis in Ukraine play any role at all, or might play any role at all, in influencing the outcome of a prospective referendum of the UK, whether to leave the EU or not? I mean, not in the sense that Ukraine is important, but the way that EU and the UK as part of the EU is able to deal with geostrategic crisis.
Okay, this is a very complicated question. I would say that there is a possibility of de-enlargement, of some member states beginning to look at the option of leaving the European Union seriously. I mean, the UK is the obvious example of that. If some of you may know that next week there will be a referendum in Scotland, and if Scotland does vote to leave the United Kingdom, that makes it more likely that the rest of the United Kingdom will vote to leave the European Union. There is also, we see in France, the rise of an explicitly anti-European party. If that were to gain power, the situation in France could become very complicated as well. I would say what is driving this rise of Euroscepticism is more the economic crisis rather than foreign policy. I think it's quite clear that that's the case, but I don't think the Ukrainian crisis is completely irrelevant to the internal debates. Why is that the case? It's because a lot of the Eurosceptic parties seem to have rather more sympathy for Russian policies than for what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, they've made statements to this effect, and they have argued that the fact that the EU has made such strong commitments to help Ukraine is actually a negative factor for European security. And that therefore, we shouldn't, it's not in the EU's vital interest to do anything to defend Ukraine, that this simply brings us into confrontation with Russia, which is an important trading and strategic partnership, and there are many people in these kind of parties who actually argue that the crisis in Ukraine is the EU's fault more than it is Russia's fault. I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is an element in current debates, and therefore, in a way, the Ukraine crisis is getting mixed up with these much broader debates about the rise of Euroscepticism. I don't think it's the most important factor, but clearly, if the EU had shown itself capable of dealing comprehensively and quickly with the crisis in Ukraine, that would have made it easier for pro-Europeans to argue that there is a really strong benefit in being part of the European Union. While the EU is struggling to deal with these external challenges, Ukraine, Iran, Egypt, etc., then it encourages some parties, political parties in some member states, to argue that it's better to go it alone. Again, I'm not saying I agree with that, but it is part of the debate.
Okay. We're opening up for the rest of you. Before we do that, I remind you that this is cooperatively organized by the Liberal Club and the Office for Democratic Belarus, and it's held within the framework of the European Intercultural Festival. And this is the second time we've had this festival in Belarus, which is a fantastic opportunity to hold events like this. And there is also a bonus, because being part of the European Intercultural Festival, we have some presents for you for, as I was informed, the best questions. I'm not sure who exactly is going to be judging what the best questions are, but
I should decide.
Yeah, probably Richard, if Office for Democratic Belarus does not mind, because the presents came from them. So please feel free to ask any questions, and then we'll decide on these prizes for you.
Good evening, my name is Anastasia. Currently I'm a master student of law faculty of Belarusian State University. Firstly, I would like you to thank for your interesting lecture. And as far as you talked a lot about the European crisis of European external policy, I would like to ask you a bit, perhaps legal question. Do you think, as for you, will it be reasonable to turn the sphere of external policy from it's called shared competence of EU to exclusive competence of European Union, or as if I got it right, you more appreciate like national interest. You talked a lot about German foreign politics, French foreign politics. So, what's your point of view? Thank you.
My answer would be no, and I think if anything, these kind of crises are pushing in the opposite direction. This is quite a complex legal question. Basically, the way that EU foreign policy is divided between the national governments and the EU institutions is very, very complicated in a legal sense. In some areas, the European Commission, the External Action Service, the EU institutions have exclusive competence, what's called competence in a legal sense. They can act on their own. They are autonomous, they are independent from the governments. In other areas, it's the governments that have legal competence, and they may cooperate on an issue, they may agree to have a single policy, but the legal responsibility is theirs, not that of the EU institutions. And the way that these competencies are divided is very, very complicated. So on some trade issues, the responsibility is that of the European Commission. On some, it's the responsibility of the European governments. We just had a new treaty signed, the Lisbon Treaty. This gives slightly more competencies, legal competencies, to the European Commission, to the EU institutions. But on the big strategic questions, the general feeling is that the really significant decisions are increasingly being made in national capitals rather than in Brussels. Which doesn't mean that European cooperation will be ineffective. It just means that the bigger governments feel that they need to keep a hold on the way that decisions are made, precisely because these are matters of strategic importance. And the way that trade policy is used, or the way that environmental policy is used, etc., has to be thought of with these strategic considerations in mind, and not simply as a kind of technical exercise, which is arguably what has happened till now. So my short answer to your question was no, I don't see this as likely in the short term. And if anything, I think the really big questions that we're talking about here today will be an issue of particularly what's decided in Berlin.
Okay. Sergey.
My name is Sergey. Thank you very much, Richard, for the presentation. It was brilliant. I have the question. So, in our country, in Russia, many people think that Europe has very weak foreign policy positions due to the very high influence of the United States. I would like to know, and sometimes really the United States force Europe to do what they don't want to do actually, as you said with Ukraine, for example. I would like to say how really strong this influence is, and what may be instruments that Americans use to influence Europe to do what they don't want to do. Threats, or maybe benefits, what? Thank you.
I think it depends very much on which area of policy we are talking about. And also it's a question on which, I'm sure you know, there are big differences between member states. If I were French or Spanish, or I would surely answer no to your question, and that there is plenty of autonomy. European governments pursue independent positions. As you know, other member states are much keener on retaining a fundamental strategic alliance with the United States. I mean, particularly the Baltic states and Poland. Their perception, whether rightly or wrongly, is that the way for them to defend their fundamental interests in light of what's happening with Russia is to bring the United States back in, rather than talking about the European Union being able to do this on its own. So I think it differs between different areas. Increasingly, the basic thinking was that the United States has been reorienting its attention towards Asia and the strategic challenges in Asia, and therefore the United States has been pushing European governments to take more responsibility in the Middle East and in the Eastern neighborhood. That was the thinking 3 or 4 years ago. I think because these crises have erupted in Ukraine, but also in the Arab states, the United States has begun to reach the conclusion that it still does need to be an actor supporting the European Union in these areas, rather than standing back and being quite so passive. So I think for me that's one of the big things that's changed since the beginning of the crisis. But then there are other issues on which the European Union and the United States are not so closely aligned, on the issues of climate, for example. So it depends very much on which kind of policy area we're talking about. I would say on the Ukraine issue, so far, surprisingly, the United States and the EU have stuck reasonably closely together. There was fear that that the differences would be quite significant, and there are differences there, but I think so far there's been a reasonable level of coordination.
Thank you for your answer. May I ask two questions? I have two questions because both Ukrainian and Belarusian situation would bother me. First question is about Ukraine. How would you comment, and I am sure that everybody in this, from this audience would debate it a lot before your visit, how would you comment the situation with Budapest memorandum that would signed in order to provide some mechanisms of defense in the Ukrainian case, as well as in Belarus? And second question, talking about the EAP, what would be the right actions that could, for example, such a member of the Eastern Partnership as Belarus take, according to our serious situation with the representative of the power, because we have a legal power not recognized by EU. So what would be those right external actions that could NGOs take, for example, in order to provide a more successful cooperation with the EU? Thank you.
In Belarus?
Yes, of course.
So I think the commitment under the Budapest memorandum is basically dead. I don't think the parties to that agreement are giving any serious thought to Crimea. I think if there's any chance for an agreement, some kind of negotiated agreement with Russia, then Western governments would not really push the issue of Crimea. That's my judgment. Again, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I think the focus is much more on eastern Ukraine. And I think that, at least in the judgment of European governments, that the chances of being able to change the new situation on the ground in terms of Crimea looks very, very remote, and it's not an issue that's really being pushed within the current debate. So I think the issue really is, in a way, the opposite. It's that if Russia judges that these kind of commitments to defense are completely meaningless now, how far will it push? And if it continues to push, at what stage are European governments willing to say, okay, at this stage we will intervene in a military fashion? As you all know, so far at the beginning of the crisis, European governments said there will be no military response from European governments, full stop. But if it gets to a situation where the current crisis extends into issues to do with Russian minorities within Baltic states, within EU territory, then I think the EU would at that stage would have to, I mean, NATO would have to respond. If it didn't respond at that stage, then the whole Article 5 commitment would be overturned and would look completely meaningless. But I think the issue of reversing the Crimea situation is not really at the top of the list at the moment. It's not really being debated. The issue is really confined to trying to stem the degree of the spread of conflict in eastern Ukraine. On the issue of engagement with partners in Belarus, I mean, you probably know better than I do. I know people here know better than I do. It's being done, and there is an effort. It's a difficult situation. The judgment is on the part of the European Union that there is a window of opportunity now to improve cooperation with Belarus, with all partners, including government partners in Belarus. There's a caution there not to engage with non-governmental partners in a way that ends up being counterproductive. It's clearly the Eastern European, the Eastern Partnership country where things are most delicate in that situation. So I wouldn't see European Union policy developing very far in that direction, unless that you can get back to some degree of positive engagement with the regime, and on the back of that try to talk in a cooperative way about broadening the range of partners that the EU has in Belarus. But I mean, people here know better than I do the problems over registration, etc., etc., and simply the practical difficulties of the EU being able to engage.
Okay, who's next?
My name is Danuta Lovachini, and I am a student of the Academy of Public Administration of the Republic of Belarus. It's why I'm interested, I'm extremely interested in one idea which you shared some minutes ago here. It's about policy making in the European Union, which was changed after the Arab Spring. So you said that aligned democracy changed to flexibility to different countries like the Republic of Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova. And just in what way we can see this flexibility, I mean, in what processes in our society we can see it, in policy making, in economy, or just it will be in some social processes, in what changes we should wait from European Union in this case, and how it will be individually made, as you said, individually to the Republic of Belarus, individually to Ukraine, and etc.
Well, don't expect revolutionary changes. I just said this is beginning to change, and it will be a long process, and it's not clear how far the change will go. But I think if you were to talk, if we had EU people here, they would, I think today, recognise some of the criticisms that have traditionally been made about the EU being a bit too slow and a bit bureaucratic. I mean, the criticism from countries around the world, not just Belarus, but from countries around the world, is that the EU can often offer very attractive packages of cooperation, but they come with rather heavy conditionality, even rather slow in delivering the benefits. I mean, one example with the Arab Spring, for example, is that the EU offered a lot of really good things to Arab countries when the Arab Spring started. It offered them the possibility of complete access to European markets, which would be very, very important. We're now 4 years on from the beginning of the Arab Spring, and the EU is only just beginning to actually negotiate these kinds of provisions. So often the EU makes very attractive promises, but it can be far too slow in delivering them. I mean, as you all know, in the last 4 years, the Arab Spring has kind of progressed, and now many people would say it's almost dead. And the EU is just getting around to actually negotiating what it promised 4 years ago. And the disappointment for many people, I mean, like yourselves, young people, civil society people in many different countries, is that the EU kind of misses the moment of opportunity, the moment of reform, when it could be making a difference. So I think there is a feeling that the EU needs to spend its money quicker. It needs to keep a focus on issues of democracy and human rights, but perhaps be a little bit more creative in the way that it uses its conditionality, and recognise the complaint that often the EU it needs to offer more, or it's offering something which could be attractive, but it requires countries to do so much in return for that, that the value of the offer becomes much less attractive. So that was the kind of development I was meaning. Of course, do remember, it's not just the European Union money that is part of the picture of overall European support. You also have a lot of money being spent by governments, and some governments do manage to spend their money and build up broader partnerships in a much more effective way. You also have new institutions like the European Endowment for Democracy that have been set up specifically in order to try and take forward this more flexible approach. But if it's not a contradiction in terms, the EU will be quite slow in being more flexible. So it's, I mean, the change won't be that revolutionary.
More questions?
Good evening, my name is Ksenia. I also would like to thank you for devoting your time and visiting our country. My question is coming back to your response with the strategic thinking and acting, and I would like to address the component of security within the European Union. So as I do agree with you that the geostrategic thinking is coming on the way to the European Union, but still, as all skepticism is based on the failures coming from the Balkan states and repeating in the Arabic Spring and every time. And I do believe that the Ukraine can be a successful example. So still, as you mentioned, the ISIS is on the way and is coming as the next reaction. So I would like to ask you, will there any changes in the decision-making process within the European Union, or with this component of security, coming back to the common foreign and security policy, to the interest or any other options?
Thank you for the question. Thank you to everyone for making the effort to make the questions in English. I would doubt it. I would doubt it. I think that your mention of the Balkans is very interesting. The Balkans is an area that is actually still very fragile and very precarious, where the EU again has exerted influence, because with the Balkan states, the EU has promised membership. And most of the Balkan states, except Bosnia, are actually locked into a process of preparing themselves to join the European Union, which is a fairly kind of technocratic exercise. They're going through all these different areas of negotiations within which they have to adopt European Union legislation. And the hope is that once they've been through this process, they'll be able to join the European Union, like Croatia did last year. And it's that process that will help lock peace and stability into the Balkans. In that sense, the EU has done very well to retain this commitment. But again, a little bit like the situation that has happened with Turkey, the EU's made the promise of membership, and now again it's not fully clear that the EU will actually follow through this promise of membership. And after such a long time of working with the Balkan states to prepare them for membership, if the European Union now were to withdraw the promise to let countries like Serbia into the European Union, this could have a really disastrous impact in the Balkans. And it might be that some European states would hold a referendum when more Balkan states join the EU. And if those referendum voted against any further enlargement, this would have a hugely negative impact on the EU's influence and on its own strategic interests and on the conditions of peace and stability within the Balkans itself. So the Balkans will be a real testing ground, because there the EU has made the kind of promises. So far, it is not making to Ukraine. So even in the Balkans, if it doesn't do that, then the prospects for any kind of effective influence over Ukraine will be much less. But in terms of changing the institutional processes in the EU, it took the EU almost 10 years to agree its last treaty. While the EU was negotiating the treaty, which is full of lots of very kind of boring details of different EU institutional processes, it took its eye off the ball. It got distracted from looking at the really big changes that were happening at the EU, at the international level. And I think now the EU doesn't need another 10 years thinking about these very detailed questions of who decides what does the European Parliament have in terms of power vis-à-vis the Commission, etc. These look very self-obsessed debates when the world is changing in such a dramatic way. And I think the danger is the EU gets rather too fixated on its own institutions rather than thinking about what it really needs to be doing in terms of the output of its foreign policy.
I've got a question that is slightly adjacent to broader security considerations. Visa. Now that the Moldovans have visa-free regime, and there is a very active civic campaign that has been ongoing in this country and in broader Eastern Partnership area that basically aims to somehow get their voices heard by European bureaucrats. Is there or might there be a wind of change in terms of European bureaucrats, or Germany or whoever for that matter might take a slightly different view of visa regimes that exist between the Eastern Partnership countries and the EU?
Good question, and I think that's the visa issue. I mean, people here will again know better than I do, but that's probably the area where the EU can have the kind of quickest and most tangible impact in countries such as yours and in other countries. And I think that to some extent there has been a change already, and the EU is certainly promising better and quicker visa liberalisation than it was willing to do 4 or 5 years ago. And certainly from a strategic point of view, governments are kind of pushing the EU to use this as one of the main tools of leverage it has over other countries. And it's as true as you say, to some extent it's being held back by people who are more interested in the technical elements. As again, I'm sure people know better than I do, countries have to fulfill a lot of technical requirements to get the visa liberalisation. And there probably, I would argue, the EU needs to be rather more flexible if it wants to gain any kind of strategic impact from what could be a really important potential tool of leverage. But it's, I think the EU has changed on this, and it's certainly recognised, and the EU's done a lot of consultations on this, and asked people what one measure could the EU do that would really have an impact and demonstrate that the EU is supporting ordinary people. And the answer is always visa liberalisation or visa facilitation. And because of that, I think the EU has moved. But there's the technical element that still needs to catch up with the strategic element. And of course, the danger that the rise of populist parties in the EU makes it far more complicated for governments to offer really meaningful visa and opening up of visas when they feel under pressure from these new populist parties.
Okay, more questions? 1, 2. Well, we've got 15 minutes left. How many questions do we have? 1, 2, more? 3, 4. Okay. Good.
Да, я, к сожалению, выпадаю из обоймы говорящей молодежи. В Праге, когда был запуск Восточного партнерства, представители гражданского общества готовили предложение Еврокомиссии, что необходимо было бы делать в этой программе. Для меня, как для бизнесмена, которого бизнес сейчас парализован экономической преступностью и коррупцией, конечно, было важно, чтобы западный бизнес приходил и сюда устанавливал, помогал устанавливать институциональные рамки. Но, к сожалению, все закончилось Вильнюсским шоком. И предвидя вот украинские события на форуме гражданского общества Восточного партнерства, мы инициировали работу по присоединению восточных партнеров к программе ЕИО. Это Европейская декларация по электронному правительству. То есть сейчас мы делаем больше упор на возможности, на условия развития информационного общества. 28 августа вот сейчас была международная конференция в Киеве, в Украине, здесь сейчас рассматривают этот вопрос. Как вы считаете, при разработке дорожных карт и Украины, и Беларусь, там будет рассматриваться, что Крым как единое целое, как Украина, единое целое территория Украины. Готовы ли страны Евросоюза голосовать по 6-му пункту резолюции территориальной целостности, поднимать вопрос 6-го пункта резолюции ООН территориальной целостности Украины, который предусматривает непризнание тех образований, в которых сейчас находится Крым. Я имею в виду таможенный союз, Евразийский экономический союз. Спасибо.
Question whether the EU would formally recognize it.
Yeah, whether the EU is ready to use diplomatic tools to activate Article number 6 of the UN Charter, which is basically about Crimea being part of another formation in the customs union. Well, that's basically something you commented on already.
Yeah, my feeling is that they would be extremely cautious about doing that. While the focus is on eastern Ukraine and the possibility of trying to negotiate some cessation to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, I think the feeling is that the most likely, the most positive way the EU has of influencing events in Ukraine is to try and help the government in Kiev reform, be more resilient, try and address the economic situation, which, as you all know, is really grave in Ukraine, rather than preempt these kind of issues on Crimea at the moment. I think that wouldn't be seen as the most productive way of influencing things.
Петровский Петр, консервативный центр Номас. У меня один вопрос к вам. У меня будет вопрос к вам, связанный с Восточным партнерством. Вот вы говорили про то, что оно превратилось в такую кризисную площадку, которая, в принципе, не выполнила ни одной цели, то есть не распространила демократию, а там, где демократия лучше всех распространялась, там либо, как на Украине, оказались территориальные проблемы и проблемы безопасности, либо, как в Молдавии, демографический коллапс, или, как Грузия, потеря части территорий. Остальные страны не участвуют в этом восточном партнерстве так рьяно. Вот. И, во-вторых, Восточное партнерство стало такой как бы антироссийской организацией, в принципе, не включило в свои возможности рассмотрения именно российских интересов экономических. Это мы видим на примере Украины, где военно-промышленный комплекс в связи с подписанием ассоциации с ЕС полностью просел. И, в принципе, Россия начала свои военные действия в Украине, в принципе, для защиты своих вот именно экономических интересов. И мы видим третий пример. Беларусь, которая, в принципе, не показывала свою силу в демократизации, а наоборот, выступила таким апологетом диктатуры, но при этом обеспечила безопасность, территориальную целостность и суверенитет. Это единственная страна из всего Восточного партнерства. Возникает вопрос, нужно ли Восточное партнерство в таком формате? Может, следует прислушаться к Белорусскому Министерству иностранных дел и включить в него Российскую Федерацию и рассматривать экономические интересы Российской Федерации также? Спасибо.
The EU always points out that it always offered this kind of partnership to Russia, but it was not taken up. the official EU line would be, I'm not an EU official, but the official EU line was that the Eastern Partnership was never meant to be anti-Russian. That was not the intention, and that there is nothing in the Eastern Partnership that needs to be interpreted as being anti-Russian. I mean, I'm sure as you all know, it's been pointed out time and time again that countries like Ukraine can retain their free trade agreements with Russia that Ukraine has had for many years, and at the same time have free trade with the European Union. So the EU's rhetoric has always been about countries deepening their relationships with the EU, this helping to make them more prosperous, and this actually being good for Russia, this helping them develop better relations with Russia at the same time. Clearly, however, and you are right, that message has not got across, or it's being used in a disingenuous way for other kinds of strategic interests. The EU has realized this, it's a bit late, but the EU has realized that when it was designing the Eastern Partnership, it never really factored in how it would be perceived by Russia or by people in Eastern countries with legitimate and genuine interests in good relations with Russia. Now it's proposing all kinds of dialogue forums and cooperation to try and make sure this is no longer the case. There's a particularly significant dialogue now with Ukraine to try and make sure that Ukraine's signing of a free trade agreement with the European Union doesn't negatively affect Russia's interests in Ukraine. But arguably that's the kind of thing that should have been done 2 or 3 years ago and may just have helped avoid the kind of crisis we have at the moment. So if an EU official was sitting here, they would say there's nothing in the Eastern Partnership that is remotely designed to be anti-Russian. But the EU clearly needs to make more of an effort to convince people that that is actually the case. That even if the intention isn't there, in practice, some of the ways in which the Eastern Partnership may change economic relations may have an unfortunate effect in our relations with Russia. And the EU's realised that and is now trying to do something about it. But of course now, it's not the best time to be trying to do this.
Здравствуйте. Скажите, в своем выступлении вы упомянули про усиление влияния Германии вследствие экономического кризиса. Вот. И как противовес этому недавно были выборы в Европарламент, и многие говорят о усилении националистических настроений в Евросоюзе. Скажите, действительно ли они имеют место быть, и смогут ли они как-то повлиять на политическую картину мира?
This is a really important question. There were elections to the European Parliament in May, and it's true that today very populist, Eurosceptic parties have a much greater presence in the European Parliament, and many of these are kind of much more inward-looking and would argue that European governments need to take care of their own populations and not pay so much attention to Eastern Partnership countries, and the EU should kind of rein back in terms of the money it spends in its neighbourhood. They will have some influence because of the fact that the European Parliament now does have some influence over European foreign policy. But again, I wouldn't exaggerate this. These parties are not in control of the Parliament, and if other parties who do want the EU to continue playing an active role in foreign policy can make a positive case for this, then I think we can still have a more positive Eastern Partnership. The thing that will really determine that is whether the EU can show that it has found a solution to its own economic crisis. The last 5 years have been really bad. European governments have had to cut back their their funds for external relations quite dramatically. There is the hope now that the recovery in some of the countries is beginning to start, that the European economy may have stabilized. And if that's the country, then clearly that will give governments slightly more scope to, again, focus their attention on foreign policy. But it's certainly a danger that you correctly identified.
Anyone new to the question? Then we'll transfer the right of the question to a new person, okay? And I guess that's going to be the last one from the audience.
Hello, my name is Nadezhda, and I want to ask you, you remember the war of dissidents of Yugoslavia, and the influence of America is making the same, and how do you think it's a systematic pressure of America to Eastern Europe?
Is the question, do I think America should engage more in pressuring, or if it has done so too much in the past?
Is it a system of or American plan to make more influence in the Europe, in the Russia, in some territory of eastern part of the Europe?
Any Americans say?
Is it like the American plan to exert more influence in the area?
There may be Americans here who know more than I do. My impression is that that's not the case. The US is not nearly as active in Eastern Europe today as it was in former Yugoslavia and the Balkans in the 1990s. I think the impression that's often given that the US kind of funded the Maidan Revolution, for example, is just not factually correct. If anything, the opposite has been the case. The US stepped back dramatically from having any kind of significant policy aims in Eastern Europe over the last 5 or 6 years. It's just now beginning to re-engage. But it's re-engaging in a context where its main concern is clearly with Asia, its secondary concern is with the Middle East, and therefore I don't think that, my impression is the region will not have the same kind of priority. It will not be the subject of kind of really assertive US policy in a way that the Balkans were in the 1990s. That would be my judgment.
Let me ask a question which I suppose will draw a line under.
The question of this girl was last, you announced.
Yeah, last from the audience, I said. The audience. It was added. I remember you wrote a nice piece before Vilnius Summit last year, which was published with Carnegie. So, any plans for a policy paper that recommends the EU member states and all the actors before the Riga Summit, which is to take place in May next year? So, any concrete steps that can be taken to improve the Eastern Partnership in this very difficult reality that we've just discussed?
My fear with the Eastern Partnership, and that it clearly is something of great importance to all of you, is that I think to some extent the crisis in Ukraine is taking up all the attention in terms of policy towards the East, and because of that the EU perhaps could be doing more in the other Eastern Partnership countries. So there is a big Eastern Partnership summit in May next year. One would hope by then that the Ukraine crisis will be less serious than it is today, and that therefore the EU can get back to thinking a bit more regionally about how Belarus relates to what's happening in Ukraine, that I know is debated a lot here in terms of what the situation in Georgia, how to try and maintain some degree of relationship with Armenia, after Armenia, of course, chose not to sign the association agreement, and to try and get some kind of regional level of cooperation going between all these different countries, when they themselves seem to be saying they need this regional dimension to try and protect their own interests as well. At the moment, the EU is not doing that much because all its attention is on the Ukraine crisis. But hopefully by the time of the summit next year, that would have changed, and the EU will be able to deliver a lot more in concrete terms than it did at the Vilnius summit, which, as you all know, was in the end it was dominated by trying to manage the crisis with Ukraine than it was in terms of really providing a forward-looking vision for the Eastern Partnership as a whole.
Richard, thank you very much. But before we go to what we usually call at the Liberal Club coffee post-scriptum, we still have this business to decide who asks the best questions, and we have 5 prizes.
I think Aliona should do this.
Aliona, are you ready? Yeah, Richard, it's up to you. You know, you shouldn't look like the EU, like not taking decisions.
I'm too democratic. Can I think about it?
Okay, over coffee post-scriptum. Those who ask questions don't leave because there is still a high chance you'll get the prizes after the coffee post-scriptum. On this, thank you very much to everyone. I just remind you that the European Intercultural Festival is still continuing, I think, until the 14th of September, and there are lots of events which might be of interest to you. But the next event of interest to you, I hope it will be of interest to you, is over there. Coffee and some cookies. Please treat yourself.